Good morning, everyone. The things that I was thinking about recently was something that maybe we don't hear too often. I know that I don't think I spoke about it before anyway. And that is the rebuke of Christ. I like to think about the blessings of Christ. I like to think about how Christ came not to condemn the world. But do you ever hear the rebuke of Christ? And I think that we can say with a great degree of confidence that if we don't hear the rebuke of Christ in our journey, we may have the wrong Christ. Because Jesus said, "As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten." So I just wrote a couple references down I thought we could read. And that first one is in Revelation chapter 3. This is speaking to the church of Laodicea. And if I start reading at verse 16, he says, "So then, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth, because you say, 'I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich, and white garments, that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Therefore be zealous and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me." And I believe it was a few weeks ago that I had shared about that verse, or from that verse, that Jesus said to John the Baptist's disciples, he said, "Go and tell John the things that you had seen and witnessed." And then he said, "Blessed is he that is not offended because of me." One of the ways that I believe it's possible for people to be offended or to be tripped up by Christ is by not being willing or humble or ready to receive the rebuke of Christ. So let's look at a few of these. You can probably think of others beyond what I have, but in Luke chapter 8 is one of these that Jesus gave to his disciples. And these are all historical things, just actual accounts that took place. They might not, I don't believe that Jesus necessarily rebukes us in all these exact same ways, but I believe it's typical, and it demonstrates how it demonstrates the capacity that we have to make mistakes as Jesus' disciples, and to be weak in faith as they were, and to be taught by Christ. So in Luke chapter 8, verse 24, this is the story of being on the lake and in the midst of a storm. They came to him and awoke him, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." Then he arose and rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was a calm. But he said to them, "Where is your faith?" I believe that came as a very I believe that came to them as a rebuke. Where is your faith? Like, this was not to be such an extraordinary thing. You know, how was it that in the midst of this challenging circumstance, and it certainly was, you know, but how was it that they so quickly forgot who was with them? In a sense, they didn't forget because they called to him and they said they're perishing. You know, so in a way they did have that level of faith, but yet he asked them that question, which was somewhat rhetorical. You know, where is your faith? They were afraid and marveled, saying to one another, "Who can this be? For he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." I know that Christ has rebuked me in this way sometimes. Where is your faith? When I was, you know, trembling and not having that confident trust in him, he has had to say that to me. Matthew 16. Let's turn to Matthew 16. Here's another example. The context here is Peter had just given that very famous proclamation that we know who you are, Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus blessed Peter for that. And in verse 21, it says that from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day. So, you know, sometimes I've thought that, you know, the disciples were kind of left in the dark about what's going on, but no, Jesus actually described to them the plot, what's going to happen. But they may have been left in the dark because they didn't receive that. For example, Peter took him aside, verse 22. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." You kind of need to appreciate that zeal and that passion that Peter had to like protect Jesus from this. Like, no, you got this one wrong. But Jesus, verse 23, but he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." While that, I believe, in my own estimation, must have been the most severe rebuke that Jesus ever gave to the disciples, or to a person, Peter himself. "Get behind me, Satan, adversary. You're an offense because you're not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." I believe that it's kind of according to the same, along the lines of the same exhortation that Paul says in Colossians, that we should mind the things of God and not the things that be of the earth. Turn over one more chapter to chapter 17, Matthew 17, verses 17 through 20. Here the disciples were unable to cure an epileptic, someone who is suffering from epilepsy, and this person had brought the victim here to the disciples for them to cure him, but they were not able to do that. And this is just breaking into the story here. Let's start at verse 16. "So I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him. Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him here to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. So Jesus said to them, verse 19. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, Why could we not cast it out? So Jesus said to them, Because of your unbelief. For assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, Move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. However, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. Have you ever heard Christ rebuke to you? Have you ever, maybe let me say it the other way around. Have you ever come to Christ and said, why did this happen? I certainly have. Why could we not cast it out? And Jesus gave them this answer, which was a rebuke, because of your unbelief. And let's look at one more, and this is also in the book of Matthew, chapter 26. Glenn already had referenced this account, I believe, this morning. This is in the Garden of Gethsemane. Verse 39, He, that is Jesus, he went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. So how can we receive these rebukes? I believe that it's important for us to recognize that the rebuke from Christ is not a condemnation. If we confuse the rebuke as a condemnation, we will be deeply discouraged, if not completely ready to give up. But let's turn to the book of Hebrews, chapter 12 yet, and read this exhortation here about how to receive the rebuke from Christ and how to respond to that. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 3. Consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself. This obviously pointing to Jesus. The writer here is saying, look at Jesus as an example of one who has endured hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. You have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. And you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. This is a quote from the book of Proverbs, I believe. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. Why not? How can one not be discouraged by the rebuke from God? For whom the Lord loves, he chastens. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son whom he receives. So rather than taking rebuke as a condemnation or as an offensive thing, something to be discouraged by, we ought to be encouraged by it. It is an act of God's love to rebuke us and to correct us. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. Like, for what son is there whom a father does not chasten? On the other hand, but if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. So which do we want to be? Well, we want to be sons of God. We rejoice that we can be sons of God. And we recognize that as a son of God, one of the realities is that we will need to endure chastening to be taught of God. And at times there are rebukes that God needs to give us, or Jesus needs to give us. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as it seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. That should be sufficient encouragement for us to be able to endure the rebuke of Christ and to be trained by it, because we know it's going to yield the peaceable fruit of righteousness. Praise the Lord.